Movie stars, World War II, and cheese? A beautiful ocean liner with incredible, breathtaking Art Deco interior pulled into New York City for the first time. Smoke billowing from her funnels as the crowd that gathered chattered giddily about her beauty and innovation. Word had spread, and she was destined to be the choice of the young, rich, and famous, and the inspiration for many things, including a popular cheese brand. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for our younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Thank you to our viewers for voting for SS Île de France. It's been a hot minute since we dove into an ocean liner's history. She was built for her owners, the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, or French Line, by Ateliers et Chantiers de Saint-Nazaire-Penouet, being laid down in 1925. She was part of a 4-ship agreement between the French Line and the French government dating back to November 1912, calling for the construction of passenger mail ships, with the first being named Paris and the second being Île de France. She was named after the region around Paris known as l'Île de France. Unfortunately, World War I would delay her construction until the 1920s, though Paris was launched in 1916 and entered service in 1921 after the war. Before we get any further into her history, let's look at her specs. She was an ocean liner with her tonnage at 43,153 gross register tons in 1927 and then upped to 44,356 gross register tons in 1949 after a refit. She was 791 feet long, had a beam of 91 feet wide, and could reach average service speeds of 23.5 knots. As for capacity, she could carry a total of 1,786 passengers split into 3 classes. Class-wise, she could carry 537 first class, 603 second class, and 646 third class passengers. Her official number was 173054, and her port of registry was Le Havre, France. She was painted black along her hull with a red keel, white superstructure, and 3 funnels before her refit in 1949, and only 2 funnels after her refit. We'll get into the juicy details of that refit later. For now, let's look at her swank interiors. In an elaborate gold-covered advertising booklet released by the French Line in 1926, the bougie new ship was promoted with illustrations of huge, elegant public rooms with female passengers fanning themselves with feather fans and smoking cigarettes, and passengers being led through the uncluttered sun deck. Her interiors were in the Art Deco style, created by one of the founders of the Art Deco style, architect Pierre Patou. The trends in ship design during the Edwardian era was based upon interiors that celebrated different styles of the past, though all were lavish and resembling the most expensive, upper-class manors and chateaux on land. For example, RMS Olympic, RMS Mauretania, and SS Imperator, all celebrating different styles, though namely the Louis XVI style. In contrast, the interiors of Île de France were modern, representing something fresh and new. For the first time ever, a ship's passenger spaces had been designed not to reproduce decorative styles of the past, but to celebrate the progressive style of the present, to a degree of modernity that was previously unseen in any other project. In stark contrast to the over-the-top dining rooms on other ships, Île de France's first-class dining room was simple yet elegant. It was also the largest dining room afloat at the time, spanning 3 decks high with a grand staircase at its entrance. In addition to this beautiful dining saloon, there was also a grand foyer that was open to 4 decks, a shooting gallery, a chapel in the neo-Gothic style, an elaborate gymnasium, and even a merry-go-round for the children. Every cabin, including the most affordable, had beds instead of bunks, which was a big change for the shipping world. Many ships on the seas at the time, especially for third-class passengers, had bunks instead of individual beds. On Île de France, even the chairs had been given new designs. As each of the major liner companies began planning the next phase of passenger ships for their fleets, many of their planners visited SS Île de France for inspiration. She was a show-stopping trendsetter. And we love that about her. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Okay, my friends, let's look at her career. She was launched on March 14, 1926 in Saint-Nazaire, witnessed by thousands of government and company officials, workers, press, and French citizens. After this, she underwent a 14-month process of fitting out, which is the process in shipbuilding that follows the launch and precedes sea trials, and is the last phase of construction. She left the shipyard on May 29, 1927 to begin her sea trials, which is the testing phase of a watercraft, and is sometimes called a shakedown cruise. After this, she headed to her home port of Le Havre on June 5, 1927. Immediately, the allure of an Art Deco ship was magnetic. The visiting press helped hype up the ship with favorable reviews out by the following week. On June 22, 1927, she left from Le Havre for New York City, and she received great attention from the Americans when she docked there. Though her official accommodation was 1,786 passengers, she averaged about 1,400 most of the time. With a large accommodation for first class at 537, she became quite fashionable like SS Paris and SS France. Captain Joseph Blancart and his chief purser Henri Villard became celebrities almost overnight. The ship was very popular among wealthy Americans, becoming the vessel of choice for the famous, stylish, and youthful. They didn't choose her for her speed. She was about as fast as Cunard's Artemis Aquitania that was launched in 1914, and no bigger than this ship either. In 1936, she was immortalized in the song A Fine Romance by Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers in the film Swing Time, with the lyric, quote, "You're just as hard to land as the Île de France." Even though she wasn't the fastest ship in the world and certainly did not win any blue ribbons, she still briefly had the quickest mail system between Europe and the United States. In July of 1928, a seaplane catapult was installed at the ship's stern for trials with two CAMS 37 flying boats that launched when the ship was within 200 miles of France, decreasing the mail delivery time by a single day. This seems revolutionary. However, it was far too costly, and in October of 1930, the catapult was removed and the service was discontinued. In 1935, SS Île de France and SS Paris had a new running mate, the new Art Deco superliner SS Normandy. Between these three ships, the French line could boast having the largest, fastest, and most luxurious ships on the North Atlantic. However, this would not last long, as two events would dismantle the French line's good fortune. Firstly, on April 18, 1939, SS Paris was destroyed by fire while docked in Le Havre. She capsized at her berth due to fire and flooding. She would remain here until after the end of the war and was scrapped on site in 1947. She also almost sank SS Liberté, but that's a different story for a different time. Check out our episode on SS Europa if you want to hear that story. The second event that clouded the success of the French line was on September 1, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, thus beginning World War II and ended civilian transatlantic traffic. SS Île de France was the last civilian ship to leave France before war totally broke out. She left Le Havre on the morning of September 3, 1939, just hours before France and the UK would declare war on Germany. The last ship to leave Europe during the war would be the paqueboat Jamaïque that left in May of 1940 from Bordeaux to South America. When Île de France departed Le Havre, 1,777 passengers were aboard, 400 more than usual and just 9 shy of her maximum capacity. Most of the passengers were Americans, many of which were tourists that were terrified of the impending war in Europe and getting the heck out of Dodge as fast as they could. During the voyage, the passengers were both inconvenienced by overcrowded conditions and their activities were limited because the ship sailed with her lights out, under cover of darkness for safety from U-boats that surely lurked the Atlantic. She arrived in New York City safely on September 9, 1939. Other ships were not as lucky as Île de France, with 16 vessels being sunk by torpedoes, mines, or gunfire while Île de France was in the Atlantic. Once she was safely berthed in her New York pier, her career as a passenger ship temporarily came to a close. The French were not anxious for her return, so she was towed to Staten Island by 10 tugs and laid up here after special dredging that cost $30,000. Her crew of 800 was reduced to a small security staff of 100 while she was inoperative for the next 5 months. She was then lent to the British Admiralty, and under their command in March of 1940, she was loaded with 12,000 tons of war materials, submarine oil, tanks, shells, and several uncrated bombers that were stowed on the after open decks. On May 1st, 1940, she left for Europe, veiled in gray and black paint for safety. From here, she moved on to Singapore. Here, after the fall of France to Germany on June 25, 1940, she was officially seized by the British for wartime service. In 1941, she returned to New York City and made several crossings from the Northeast as a troop ship, much like the crossing on February 14, 1944, sailing from Halifax, Nova Scotia to Greenock, Scotland, carrying the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, among others. In October of 1942, Île de France was tied up along the Charlemagne Quay in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Her furniture, fittings, chandeliers, carpets, and hundreds of square feet of rare and beautiful paneling were torn out as, quote, she was gutted as thoroughly as a herring. A small party of workmen then fitted her out as a floating prisoner of war camp, quote, with festoons of barbed wire sprouting from her decks and disfiguring her graceful lines. She was then tasked with bringing POWs back from North Africa to Europe. These extensive alterations were the largest ever undertaken in the harbor and were completed in 1943. This was her task until the end of the war. In the fall of 1945, Île de France was returned to the French line after serving 5 years in the military for the British Admiralty. In honor of her wartime service, the Southern Railway Company named one of its locomotives French Line CGT. Before she would see passenger service again, she ferried American and Canadian troops home in 1946. In April of 1947, she returned to her builders in Saint-Nazaire to be fully restored, and this would take 2 long years. Her third dummy funnel was removed, and an upturn of the straight black hull now met its upper forepeak, keeping up with the new style of the French line's ships beginning with Normandy in 1935. These changes would increase her gross tonnage to 44,356 gross register tons. SS Île de France was new and improved. And our YouTube members and patrons help keep us on our toes. This episode couldn't be possible without our amazing YouTube members and patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Alright folks, let's look at the end of her career and scrapping. Her first post-war luxury crossing took place in July of 1949, and she proved to be just as popular as she always was. In 1950, she received a new running mate, SS Liberté, that I mentioned earlier, and she was the former German blue ribbon holder SS Europa, paid to the French as war reparations for the loss of SS Normandy. SS Île de France would continue her celebrity career, being the setting for part of the first act of the Jules Stein Broadway musical Gentlemen Prefer Blondes in 1949, starring Carol Channing. On September 21, 1953, she rescued 25 of the 26-man crew of the Liberian freighter Greenville, which was damaged and later sank in an Atlantic tropical storm. She also played a major role in the rescue of passengers during the sinking of SS Andrea Doria after SS Stockholm had crashed into her off Nantucket. She'd been returning to Le Havre from New York, heading east and roughly 44 nautical miles away from the collision site with 940 passengers and a crew of 826 aboard. She was one of the fastest and largest passenger liners on the Atlantic at the time, captained by the well-respected veteran of the seas, Captain Raoul de Baudin, and he'd served the French line for 35 years. He was skeptical at first that Andrea Doria was in danger and tried to contact her for more details. If he went to the rescue and was not needed, he would delay his passengers and cost the French line a lot of money. However, after getting in contact with the Stockholm and a couple other ships in the area, he figured out it was serious and turned Île de France around, heading to the rescue of Andrea Doria. They arrived on scene less than 3 hours after the collision, and cautiously, they didn't want to run over any lifeboats or passengers in the water with their massive ship. They arrived in a dense fog, and this made visibility poor, but the fog luckily cleared as they drew closer. Captain de Baudin rounded the ship to the starboard side of Andrea Doria to shelter her from the wind and waves, and ordered all of her lights turned on, which was a huge relief to the passengers on the doomed liner. Île de France managed to save the majority of the remaining passengers that had not escaped in lifeboats by shuttling 10 of her lifeboats back and forth, and receiving lifeboat loads from other ships on the scene. In total, roughly 753 passengers from Andrea Doria found their way onto Île de France, and some of the passengers of Île de France gave up their cabins to the survivors. It was an intense 6-hour rescue operation, and Île de France and her crew were heroes. Île de France took the survivors back to New York City before heading off to Le Havre as scheduled. She served a normal career, though with the development of jet transport and the decline of ocean travel, the French line wished to quietly rid themselves of this beautiful ship. In November of 1958, she left New York City for the last time, being sold to a Japanese shipbreaker in 1959 and leaving Le Havre for the last time on February 26th. She was then renamed Furansu Maru, and the French flag was replaced with the Japanese flag. This isn't the end, however. Just before her scrapping, she was used as a floating prop for the 1960 Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer disaster movie The Last Voyage, with the fictional name SS Clarendon. The French line actually sued MGM to have the ship's funnels repainted and prohibited the name Île de France from appearing on the ship in the movie, which is odd but understandable. The Last Voyage was filmed almost entirely in the inland sea off the coast of Osaka, Japan, and during filming, the ship was partially sunk, the forward funnel was sent crashing into the deckhouse, and explosive devices were detonated in the interior of the once great liner. After the film was done, the Japanese scrappers refloated her and towed her to the scrapyard, and she was fully dismantled by 1961. Her legacy lives on in multiple ways. In 1931, the 9th floor restaurant in Eaton's department store in Montreal, Canada was styled after the first-class restaurant aboard Île de France. The store owner's wife, Lady Eaton, had just traveled on the liner at the time and requested it to be in the style of Île de France, and, like a good husband, he obliged. The company is defunct as of 2002, being purchased by Sears Canada, which is also defunct now as of 2018. Île de France is also the logo and namesake of the French-imported premium cheese brand Île de France. This cheese brand still exists to this day and is known for their brie. If you've tried it, let me know your thoughts in the comments section. SS Île de France was an Art Deco goddess among aging Edwardian liners, and revolutionized the standard for shipping at the time. Her legacy lives on in history books, luxury, and of course a popular cheese brand. She is one of the lucky ships to have made it to the scrapyard, and while this is a better fate than to sink, it is still a shame she couldn't have been preserved as a museum ship. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our Ocean Liners playlist in the cards. Next week, we get into the story of H.L. Hunley, a Confederate-American submarine that briefly served in the American Civil War and was the first combat submarine to sink a warship. Thank you for tuning into Shipwreck Sunday, have a great week, and we'll see you next time.